Another Saturday, another study. We were busy last Saturday, weren't we, with a tournament? But here we go with another study. This time, Matthew 15. In our continuing fulfillment series, this time, the fulfillment of vain worship. Once again, Isaiah is being referenced here. This time, reverting back to Isaiah 29, verse 13. As if Isaiah was expecting vain worship to be the rule rather than the exception of Israel in the not too distant future. Well, 700 years later anyways. The rule, as Israel begins to develop detailed rules of conduct called the Mishnah. Rules based solely on the traditions of the elders, rules that continue to be held to this day. So here Jesus attempts a major corrective on their perverted rules, a corrective on unwashed hands at the very, very least. But before we get to that major corrective, let's do a major corrective on these mass feedings of Jesus, with another mass feeding occurring yet again in this chapter. Exactly where? We are not told. As suggested earlier, the earlier location was not really addressed by our commentators, other than France suggesting that the location of the first feeding might have been the traditional site of Tabgha on the west side of the lake, more in accordance with Mark, but that the Bethsaida area definitely seems more probable, according to Matthew, the northernmost tip of the lake, or somewhere thereabouts. This difficulty is, well, not well developed by France. Well, maybe it's in his other Matthew commentary, or maybe it's in his Mark commentary, but not well developed here. Nothing at all like his comment that Luke is out of sequence that we mentioned earlier. Perhaps because Mark is so highly revered by so many biblical scholars, revered as being so formative for the writers of the other Gospels, wrongly considered the cheat sheet for the other Gospels to plagiarize due to its lesser agenda or polemic commentary. Which begs the question, why did those other Gospels differ so greatly, or differ in content as well as in comment? Now, although Carson also suggests the first feeding was on the east side of the lake rather than the west side of the lake, he doesn't deal with the Tabgha conundrum either. That's not a hill to die on, apparently. Let them sell their mosaic plates. It won't defile my fish or bread, in my belief, for that matter. In like manner, Carson now defers to Walter Wessel's commentary on Mark for the location of this second feeding. Wessel, who claims that this second feeding was also on the east side of the lake, with respect to the Jordan River, with Wessel's Weasley suggestion being that the second feeding was in the Decapolis. Yeah, in the Decapolis. A pretty vague location, a pretty large area, as we will see. A second feeding that must have been quite some time later, since there seems to be a good deal of traveling involved prior. A feeding quite some time after tripping around Tyre and Sidon, at any rate. And quite some time later, since the disciples seem to have forgotten, unlike good quizzers, forgotten the first mass feeding at this point in time, perhaps even a year later. Also, since there seems to have been a good deal of healing involved prior to that second feeding. Yes, enough healing to accrue a pretty good crowd once again. Yes. A feeding that was also somewhere in the territory of Herod the Tetrarch, or pardon me, Philip the Tetrarch. still well away from that other ambitious tetrarch who was still wishing, wanting to be King Herod, or at least nearly as great as his father was in earlier times. Yes, there's Philip's area right there. Philip's area, which pretty much equates with the Decapolis. A pretty big area, as I mentioned. So this is a feeding that was also in the territory of Philip, still away from that other ambitious tetrarch. Yes, and so this illustration comes from another good website. I should have indicated that, although I disagree with these travel trails somewhat. So it was likely on the southernmost tip of the Lake of Galilee this time, the southernmost tip around here. In a place with some pretty rugged ground now, we read in verse 35, ground, instead of the more grassy terrain around Ceylon Beach up at Bethsaida. Yes, and this second feeding may have been somewhere around Monkey Beach. It is now known as Monkey Beach, a somewhat more rocky beach, a beach without grass or monkeys. And you can get some pretty good visuals here if you pop on this link. It's a pretty good video of the general terrain there. And then after that second feeding, they took the good-sized boat to Magadan, according to Matthew. Yes, this is probably not a typo of Magdala, according to our textual critic Comfort. Or they took the good-sized boat to Dalmanatha, according to our cut and paste Mark. Yes, which may have been very different names for the very same village, just as the lake had several different names. Or that may have been a larger village in close proximity to the other in order to identify the smaller by the larger. However, neither of those villages have been identified by present archaeology. That village of Magadan remains a lost village. If modern archaeology and God's recent timing is any indication, a village that I expect to be found relatively soon. Now, despite that spelling technicality, that later landing of that good-sized boat may have been in a village just north of Tiberias. The later landing may have been in a village just north of Tiberias, if the name Magdala is any indication. Yeah, somewhere around there. Okay. A suburb of Magdala, perhaps, a place where Mary of Magdalene may have come from, an area where Jesus had just fled from sometime earlier, perhaps a year earlier. But let's take a look at the first major corrective of the Pharisees instead. At the Pharisees first. That first major corrective after the mass feeding, first mass feeding, before the second major corrective after the second major mass feeding. Now, whether those Pharisees came up from Jerusalem to where did they land after they did that first feeding? Well, Gennesaret, right? Up near Capernaum, Gennesaret. So, whether they came up specifically to cool down Jesus at that point is not all that clear from the grammar. Definitely not just to make sure the disciples washed their grubby hands. No. It was a facetious jibe at Jesus. They may have been in Tiberias anyway, which was a hotbed for Orthodox teaching, a hotbed for proper Hebrew teaching, even now. And Jesus doesn't address their unwashed question directly, but immediately attacks them on other grounds. He attacks them, Pharisees, for not honoring their father and mother. Now there's an elusive bait and switch tactic, huh? Well, he accuses those Pharisees of promoting a robbing of Israel's mothers, fathers, and mothers by their saying, basically, if anyone declares that what might have been used to help their father or mother in times of need is now henceforth dedicated to God, well, that they are well within their rights to do so, since God is far greater than their parents, that God helps those that help themselves, and help the temple, of course. And to that end, God will reward them robbers mightily for such properly pious donations. Well, that sounds a bit like the screwy steward of Luke 16:9 now, doesn't it? A patronizing saying that would help the Pharisees enrich their lavish temple in Jerusalem with the donations of such disaffected and disobedient children. A saying very much like the invention of penance by a certain church around the time of Martin Luther, when they had a similar saying by a man named Tetzel enriching a church called St. Peter's. And you know where that is, right? However, their hearts were far from God or godly, as Isaiah critiqued in that 19th chapter of his. The hearts of those hypocrites were buried deep within their wallets. And hypocrites was a completely Greek word. No Hebrew or Aramaic equivalent there, not like hippos from hippus, as you may have seen in our map, anything silly like that. A word that reeks of entitled politicians telling people to stay home during a pandemic while they go sunbathing in Hawaii or the like. Yeah. But in this particular case, those Pharisees would encourage donations while foregoing donations, donating themselves. Not only was their worship vain, but an exercise in hypocrisy as well. Say one thing and do another, right? Then Jesus equates the defilement that comes out of the mouths of those hypocrites with the alleged defilement of unwashed hands, saying that there is virtually no comparison in this more logically ordered account than Mark. In fact, zero comparison spiritually. Unwashed hands do not defile them, not in the least. The disciples then asked Jesus to tone it down a bit, go easy on their blind guides, that their guides are only trying to help with their brand new codification, their brand new human rules, soon to be called the Mishnah. But Jesus won't go easy, and in the interest of peace, goes away instead, away to Tyre and Sidon, places that he had referred to earlier. But not before he gives the disciples the parable or simile of those Pharisees being pulled up by the roots in that soon-to-be-seen kingdom of heaven judgment. Roots that will die an ever slow and ever painful death, that will die for defying the 5th commandment of the Decalogue and for encouraging others to defy it. Now, I wouldn't be the least bit surprised if the combative statement of whatever goes into someone's mouth does not defile them has somewhat broader implications, however. Far broader implications. To that end, I wouldn't be the least surprised if there are even implications about the frequent hand washing that we are currently obsessing about in this present pandemonium. And as well as implications about the masks that we are currently using to prevent certain particles from entering our mouths. Yes, he was definitely not talking about kosher food here with the Pharisees. No, that was certainly not the issue. Certainly not the issue. To that end, Jesus was saying that those particles do not defile you. They might make you sick, but defilement is an entirely different issue, a different category altogether. Let's get that straight now. If you do a word study, you will find the word defiled gets used a lot, in a lot of biblical contexts, an awful lot of biblical contexts. And the closest we actually come to defiled hands is the hands defiled with blood of Isaiah chapter 59 now. But that bloody text is getting a little ahead of ourselves. That will have to wait till chapter 27. But here, Jesus uses the context of thoughts that come out of the heart. Thoughts as being defiling in verse 18. Something even more invisible. If only we could put a mask on our hearts, right? To that end, someone actually spitting on you should be merely considered uncleanness. Yes, the uncleanness of Leviticus 15. Not defilement in the least. It is merely uncleanness. Which begs the question, of course, did that spitting actually defile Jesus in our upcoming commentary of Matthew 26 and 27? Or did it merely make him unclean? There's absolutely no comparison. No comparison. Jesus would not offer a defiled sacrifice. Absolutely no comparison, unlike the equivocation of some. This is not a radical rewriting of the purity laws by Jesus, as some commentators shyly suggest. Not a tremendous tension to resolve against Jesus saying that he had not come to abolish the law. Not a tremendous tension. No, when this would suggest that he actually did. However, this is a radical declaration nonetheless. A declaration that does not render null and void the uncleanness laws of earlier times. It does not render them null and void. Not just yet, anyway. Not till the time of Reformation that we spoke to in Hebrews 9. Not till the upcoming time of the Holy Spirit. Now, an example of an incident improperly considered defilement might be that of Dinah allegedly being defiled in Genesis chapter 34. Defiled when she traveled into enemy territory, going out to make friends with the pagan Canaanites and getting more of a friend than she bargained for. She was then thought to be mortally and morally defiled by her brothers when she was seduced by a man that loved and spoke tenderly to her and wanted to marry her afterward even. However, an entirely different Greek word is being used in our authoritative Septuagint here. What is that? I mentioned earlier about our Septuagint. Yes, our Septuagint. And here we see that authoritative word circled here. A word suggesting stained rather than defiled. Yes, stained. Defiled is a different word altogether. Stained. Stained glass rather than broken glass. There's a distinct and drastic difference here. A difference completely unworthy of the deceit and murder and many other atrocities that followed the Dinah incident. Even Jacob was not impressed with the incredible carnage that followed. Carnage rightly causing him to immediately flee to Bethel for the doings of his sons. Now, if you're a big fan of the earliest Hebrew rendering instead, which came out in 1010 AD, there's the Leningrad text there. If you're a big fan of the Hebrew rendering, the first explanatory gloss of Tameh is unclean in our finest of Hebrew lexicons, as in being made unclean by Shechem. Made unclean by Shechem. Yes, made unclean by a prince of all things. I guess she didn't have any princess aspirations, right? Made unclean by a prince, as in the countless concubines being made unclean by King Solomon. Now, perhaps I'm just in denial, but a context that suits the gloss of not being defiled better. And in that context, according to the later laws of Moses, Jacob should have been given 50 shekels of silver instead. Read about that in Deuteronomy. A generous dowry for a foolish daughter. In like manner, that far broader implication is present when it may be seen that Jesus also speaks to adultery and sexual immorality in our very immediate context, suggesting something far more extreme than mere hand washing, with a far broader scope as well. Hand washing, nowhere in that more extreme radar. And the parallel washing of Pilate, I wash my hands of this man's blood, and of the elders of Deuteronomy 21:6, are completely irrelevant. That was just symbolic. Now this is such a radical implication that Jesus decides to say it twice. Yes, verses 11 and 20. Again, he says this motto twice because it's so very, very nice. Yeah. How's that for a spiffy motto? Now, do you find that lack of defilement to be a deeply comforting thought, dear reader? Do you? A comforting thought to men or women, boys or girls, who may have been abused in the past? Those of you who wrongly feel that you have been defiled as a result? That feel that you have been irreparably damaged as a result? That feel you simply cannot be put back together like a shattered Humpty Dumpty? Well, if you are not comforted by that totally unique and revolutionary saying of you not actually being defiled, then perhaps you need a little more faith. A little more faith in the words of Jesus. Perhaps even a great faith, as we will now see illustrated by a woman that is now being presented as a test case. A woman who was a much despised Canaanite, despised by even those semi-inclusive disciples. Yes, Joshua kicked their evil Canaanite butts out of the promised land more than a millennium before. Yet the historical hostility remained between them. And this woman was from those people who were the most persistent and most insidious of Israel's enemies, according to France. A woman that was somewhat local to the area where Jesus was now at. Local to a place way up north now. Local to sinful Sidon. a place well away from the lost sheep of Israel. Now, a woman that the disciples quite naturally wanted to send away. Send her to Hades, if that were even possible. You see, any enemy of Joshua's is an enemy of mine. Which reminds me of a little joke about an anemone. Cute little joke. Go there if you want to hear that joke again. Yet somehow that Canaanite woman knew that it would be hypocritical of Jesus to come all the way up north if it merely was to preach, if it wasn't also to heal, to take refuge up north without giving back to some lesser degree. They'd heard the rumors from down south and out east about this amazing prophet who cast out demons and even raised a dead girl to life. A prophet who was spurning the spurious and specious laws of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Perhaps even heard that earlier reference to Tyre and Sidon. Yeah, it may have been burning in their pagan ears and burning on their hearts. Yet she believed those rumors about this particular prophet, that he could cast out demons and even sin. And she knew that there just had to be a solution for her desperate Sidon condition. It is suggested by France and Calvin that she knew the Isaiah prophecy that was currently floating around. A prophecy that has now progressed all the way to chapter 49. She knew that this Savior and Redeemer was supposed to reveal himself to the end of the earth, not just to Israel, but even to those Canaanite dogs, as they were called. She knew that this long hoped for Son of David, yes, that's her reference, Son of David, was supposed to show himself to those who were in darkness, even to those in Sinim, wherever that mysterious place may be. Her faith was not without some revelation. This was something that she had already learned, according to Calvin. And her daughter? Well, her daughter was definitely in darkness, definitely in sin, and definitely needed a Savior. No, mere lip service from Jesus would have been a sign of a merciless prophet. Instead, this prophet would have to put his motto where his mouth is. Otherwise, that man's religion is worthless. So, true to form, Jesus healed her daughter. Instantly, healed her from some form of demon. Healed her from a considerable distance. An at-distance healing, not unlike our current at-distance schooling. Or at least we believe that healing did occur at that very instant. Occurred at the speed of a pretty good internet connection. That healing may even have been confirmed as they worked their way on over to Caesarea Philippi, to be exact. Yes, she and her daughter may have even followed Jesus and the 12 disciples there. They have been a traveling witness to his inclusive grace and mercy. Yet even today, Jesus continues to heal many sons and daughters, heals them of their greatest sickness. Distance is no object. In closing, are you healed by the Son? Healed of your greatest sickness? Healed of your sin? Well, all it takes is a little bit of faith. A little bit of faith in Jesus. Although, as we saw from this Canaanite woman, the bigger the faith, the better. So in closing, are you going to live by that solid saying of Jesus? Or is that just a borrowed motto? Is it?